October 7, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. ***. The snow falls in silence. It does not discriminate. It buries the broken treads of Tiger tanks and Sherman hulls alike. It covers the letters never sent home, the ration tins emptied in desperation, the frozen hands of boys who will never again feel warmth. In a shallow foxhole near the village of Houffalize, a young Obergefreiter named Klaus Brenner crouches beside a battered torn de feu D2 field radio, its casing cracked, its dials unresponsive. He has not slept in 3 days. The static that once connected him to his company, to his officers, to some semblance of order in this collapsing world, has gone silent. He does not know it yet, but in 6 days he will be a prisoner of war. And in that captivity he will witness something that will unsettle him more deeply than any artillery barrage ever could. The winter of 1944 had been supposed to be Germany's resurrection. Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, was Hitler's gamble, his final thrust through the dense forests of the Ardennes to split the Allied lines, recapture Antwerp, and force the Americans and British to sue for peace in the West. The planning had been meticulous. The secrecy, extraordinary. Over 200,000 German troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces had been assembled in absolute silence. The weather was an ally. Thick fog and low clouds grounded Allied air superiority. For a brief, intoxicating moment in mid-December, it seemed the Wehrmacht might yet reverse its fortunes. American positions buckled. Entire regiments were encircled. The surprise was total. But surprises, like fuel and ammunition, run out. By mid-January, the German offensive had stalled. The skies cleared. American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons turned the roads into carnage. Patton's Third Army punched north to relieve Bastogne. The German spearheads, once so confident, now found themselves isolated, exhausted, and running on fumes. Literally. Panzer divisions that had expected to capture American fuel depots found only scorched earth. The grand offensive became a grinding retreat. Klaus Brenner's radio had died somewhere in this chaos, not from enemy fire, but from the simpler cruelties of winter and neglect. A cracked vacuum tube. Corroded connections. The cold that made solder brittle and batteries useless. In the Wehrmacht of 1945, there were no spare parts. There were barely spare men. When the Americans overran his position on the morning of January 23, Brenner did not resist. His rifle was empty. His hands were numb. He raised them into the gray sky and waited. The prisoner-of-war camps that received the influx from the Battle of the Bulge were hastily expanded affairs. Barbed wire perimeters in Belgian fields, repurposed barns, guarded tent cities that grew almost overnight. The Geneva Convention was observed with American practicality. Adequate shelter, sufficient food, medical care for the wounded. But it was not the adherence to law that struck the German prisoners most forcefully. It was the sheer, incomprehensible abundance. Klaus Brenner had grown up in the Reich of deprivation. First the Depression, then rearmaments austerity, then total wars rationing. By 1945, Germany was starving. Bread was cut with sawdust. Meat was a memory. Civilian rations in Berlin provided 1,100 calories a day, if they could be obtained at all. Soldiers fared little better. The Wehrmacht's logistics had collapsed. Men marched on empty stomachs and fought on willpower alone. So when Brenner arrived at the American camp and was handed a meal tray, white bread, canned beef, potatoes, butter, coffee with sugar, and a small bar of chocolate, he stared at it as though it were a hallucination. He was not alone. Across the camp, thousands of German soldiers experienced the same cognitive dissonance. They had been told for years that America was weak, soft, a mongrel nation rotting from within, incapable of sustaining a war effort. Dr. Goebbels' propaganda had painted a picture of a degenerate society, its factories idle, its people divided, its soldiers cowardly. Yet here was evidence to the contrary, served on a metal tray 3 times a day. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Werner Hoffmann, later wrote in his diary, "They feed us better than we fed ourselves in 1939, before the war even began. Where does it all come from? Do they not know shortage? Do they not know sacrifice?" The question gnawed at them. It was on his 4th day in captivity that Klaus Brenner's world turned again. An American sergeant, a man named Tom Kowalski from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was making rounds through the compound with a bored expression and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He noticed a cluster of German prisoners gathered around something, murmuring in low tones. Curious, Kowalski approached. They were huddled around Klaus Brenner's broken radio. The Obergefreiter had carried it with him, a pointless burden, a memento of function and order now lost. One of the other prisoners, a former electronics technician named Dieter Kurz, had been examining it with the hopeless optimism of a man trying to fix a watch with no tools. They were debating in German whether the capacitor or the tube was the primary failure when Kowalski leaned in. "Radios busted?" he asked in his rough, functional German. The prisoners looked up, wary. Ja, Brenner said quietly. "It does not work." Kowalski shrugged. "Let me take a look." He picked up the radio as casually as one might pick up a newspaper. The Germans watched, skeptical. What could this American sergeant, this representative of a nation they'd been taught was mechanically inferior, do with a precision German instrument? Kowalski turned it over, popped open the back panel, and frowned. "Yeah, tube's cracked. Connections are shot too. Gimme a sec." He walked off. The Germans exchanged glances. A few laughed, dark, cynical laughs. Of course the American would not return. Of course he was mocking them. Why would he help? 20 minutes later, Kowalski returned. He carried a small toolbox, a replacement vacuum tube, solder, and a piece of wire. Without ceremony, he sat down on an empty crate, placed the radio on his knee, and began to work. His hands moved with practiced ease, testing connections, cleaning corrosion, replacing the tube, resoldering a loose ground. The prisoners watched in silence. Within 15 minutes, the radio emitted a crackle of static. Kowalski tuned the dial. A voice emerged, faint, distorted, but unmistakably a broadcast. He grinned. "There you go. Good as new. Well, good as old." He handed it back to Brenner. The Obergefreiter took the radio with both hands, staring at it as though it had come back from the dead. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kowalski shrugged again, standing up. "Why not? It's just a radio." He walked away, whistling something that might have been a Glenn Miller tune. Klaus Brenner sat in the cold Belgian mud, holding a functional radio he no longer needed, his mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. The incident spread through the camp like a whispered myth. The Americans had fixed a German radio. Not because they needed to. Not because they were ordered to. Just because they could. It was a small thing. Insignificant in the grand sweep of armies and nations. But to men who had been raised in a culture of scarcity, in a system that hoarded and rationed and controlled, the casual generosity was destabilizing. Because it was not an isolated event. American guards shared cigarettes with prisoners. Medics treated German wounded with the same urgency they treated their own. A camp carpenter, noticing that the prisoner barracks were drafty, spent an afternoon patching gaps in the walls, on his own initiative, without orders. When a load of Red Cross parcels arrived and there was a surplus, it was distributed to the POWs. To the Germans, this was incomprehensible. In the Wehrmacht, resources were weapons. Food, fuel, medicine, these were instruments of control, rationed to maintain hierarchy, to reward loyalty, to punish deviation. The Nazi state had built itself on the philosophy that scarcity justified ruthlessness, that only the strong deserved to thrive, that compassion was weakness. But here were the Americans, victors in battle, acting as though abundance were infinite, as though there was enough for everyone, as though helping, even an enemy, cost nothing. Werner Hoffmann, the former schoolteacher, tried to make sense of it in his diary. They do not hoard. They do not guard their plenty with suspicion. It is as though they believe there will always be more. Perhaps this is the secret we never understood. Perhaps this is why they won. The United States in 1945 was, in terms of raw industrial output, a civilization operating on a scale unprecedented in human history. While Europe burned and Asia bled, American factories produced an avalanche of material that defied comprehension. In 1944 alone, the United States manufactured over 96,000 aircraft, 50,000 tanks, and 17 million tons of shipping. American shipyards launched a new Liberty ship, on average, every 42 hours. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. The American economy, far from buckling under wartime strain, had expanded. GDP grew by over 70% between 1940 and 1945. This was not merely industrial capacity. It was a philosophy made tangible. The United States had entered the war with an economic model built on mass production, standardization, and the belief that efficiency could overcome scarcity. The assembly line, pioneered by Henry Ford, had democratized the automobile. Now it democratized warfare. Every soldier was equipped not with the best rifle, but with a good enough rifle produced by the millions. Every unit was supplied not with bespoke solutions, but with interchangeable parts and field manuals that assumed repair, not replacement. The M4 Sherman tank was not superior to the German Panther in armor or firepower. But for every Panther destroyed, Germany could barely produce a replacement. For every Sherman lost, 5 more rolled off the lines. It was a war of logistics as much as valor. And the Germans, for all their tactical brilliance and early victories, had never understood this. They had built a war machine predicated on quality, on the superior will of the Herrenvolk, on the assumption that spirit could triumph over material. Klaus Brenner's radio, fixed casually by an American sergeant with spare parts pulled from a stockpile so vast it could afford to be generous, was a microcosm of why Germany lost. Yet the Americans seemed to operate on a different logic entirely. They were strong, victorious, dominant, and they shared. They repaired. They healed. Not out of softness, but out of a strange confidence that there was enough to go around, that power did not require cruelty, that winning did not mean the enemy must be ground into the dirt. This was profoundly threatening to men who had built their identities on the belief that the world was harsh and only the ruthless survived. Dieter Kurz, the electronics technician, found himself in a conversation with an American soldier from Iowa, a farm boy named Jim Larson. Larson had brought over a thermos of coffee and, through halting German and gestures, struck up a conversation about radios. Both men had been technicians before the war. "Why did you help us?" Kurz asked finally, the question that haunted them all. Larson seemed puzzled by the question. "You needed help. I could help." Seemed simple. "But we are enemies." "Yeah," Larson said, sipping his coffee. "But the war's gonna end. Then what? We all go home, right? Might as well not be assholes about it." Kurz had no response to that. In the universe he'd been trained to inhabit, enemies remained enemies until one was destroyed. The idea that enmity might be temporary, that humanity might persist beyond the battlefield, was foreign. That night he lay awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his brother, killed on the Eastern Front. He thought about his mother in Dresden. He thought about the radio, fixed for no reason except that it could be. And he wondered if everything he'd believed was a lie. The transformation was not universal, nor was it immediate. Many prisoners clung to their ideology, convinced that American kindness was a trick, a propaganda ploy, a temporary mask over the same cruelty they believed governed all nations. Some nursed their hatreds and waited for the Reich's promised superweapons to reverse the war's tide. But for others, men like Brenner, like Kurz, like Hoffman, the cracks in their worldview widened. They began to ask questions they'd never dared ask before. If America could afford to feed its enemies, what else had they been lied to about? If a sergeant from Pittsburgh could fix a radio without thought of gain, what did that say about the necessity of ruthlessness? If the war could end and men could go home and treat each other as human beings again, what was it all for? The Nazi state had demanded total belief. It had promised that suffering would be rewarded with glory, that sacrifice would birth a 1,000-year empire. But the empire was crumbling, and the Americans, the soft and degenerate Americans, were the ones with full stomachs, working equipment, and confidence in the future. Werner Hoffmann wrote again in his diary, "I begin to understand. They fight not because they hate us, but because they believe in something. Not a leader, not a race, but an idea. And that idea is not scarcity, but abundance. Not hierarchy, but equality. They believe there is enough for everyone, and so they act as though it is true. Perhaps belief makes it so." Among the small objects that came to symbolize this ideological chasm, the radio held particular weight. In German hands, the torn .Fu.D2 had been an instrument of control, a means to command, to coordinate, to enforce the will of superiors upon subordinates. It was a tool of the hierarchy, fragile and irreplaceable, guarded jealously because there were never enough. In American hands, it became something else, a device to be repaired, shared, made functional again. Not because it was strategically necessary, but because repair was assumed to be possible, because the parts existed, because the knowledge was common. The radio, broken and then restored, became a silent testament to two philosophies. One that hoarded and controlled and accepted entropy as inevitable. One that assumed abundance, that trained its soldiers to fix rather than discard, that believed in the possibility of renewal. For Klaus Brenner, the radio sat beside his bunk for the remainder of his captivity. He never turned it on again. There was nothing he needed to hear. But he kept it, polished it, checked its dials out of habit. It was no longer a communications device. It was a question he could not answer, a weight he could not set down. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The camps emptied slowly. Prisoners were processed, interrogated, sorted. Some were repatriated. Others were sent to labor details to help rebuild the continent they'd helped destroy. Klaus Brenner returned to Germany in the summer of 1946, to a land unrecognizable. His hometown was rubble. His family, scattered or dead. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. He found work as a mechanic, repairing radios and other electronics in a small shop in the British zone. The skills he'd learned in the Wehrmacht served him in peace. He did not speak much about the war. Most men didn't. But late at night, when the shop was closed and the streets were silent, he would sometimes think about that day in the Belgian camp. The American sergeant with the toolbox. The casual competence. The shrug. Why not? It's just a radio. He wondered how much of the world could be different if more men believed that. Historians, in the decades that followed, would document the material reasons for Allied victory: the industrial output, the manpower, the strategic decisions. They would produce charts and graphs demonstrating the inevitability of Germany's defeat once the United States entered the war. The numbers were overwhelming. But numbers alone do not explain the human dimension. They do not explain why a sergeant from Pittsburgh took 20 minutes to fix an enemy's radio. They do not explain why prisoners of war ate better in captivity than they had in their own army. They do not explain the quiet disillusionment of men who discovered that the world did not have to be as cruel as they'd been taught. The ideological war was fought not just on battlefields, but in mess halls and prison camps, in small gestures of competence and generosity that suggested a different way of being. The Germans had waged a war predicated on the belief that humanity was locked in a Darwinian struggle for scarce resources, that only the strong deserved to survive, that compassion was a civilizational weakness. The Americans, imperfectly, inconsistently, but unmistakably, demonstrated an alternative. They fought with a productive capacity that assumed abundance. They treated even enemies as though the war would end and everyone would have to live together afterward. They repaired rather than discarded, shared rather than hoarded, and did so not out of naive idealism, but out of a pragmatic confidence in their own strength. This was not propaganda. This was not a strategic deception. This was the operational philosophy of a society that believed, however imperfectly it practiced that belief, that there was enough for everyone. And against that belief, against the casual certainty of a Pittsburgh mechanic fixing a German radio in a Belgian prison camp, the ideology of scarcity and domination shattered. Not all at once. Not completely. But irrevocably. April 2003. Frankfurt, Germany. ****. Klaus Brenner died at the age of 81, in a clean hospital room, surrounded by grandchildren he'd never expected to have. His life after the war had been quiet, productive, unremarkable. He'd built radios, raised a family, paid his taxes, and voted in democratic elections. He'd never spoken much about the war. But among his effects, his grandson found an old military radio, carefully preserved, its casing polished smooth by decades of handling. There was a note taped to it, written in the shaky handwriting of old age. ***A broken thing, made whole again, by a stranger who owed me nothing. I spent 50 years trying to understand why. I think now I do. He believed there was enough. Enough parts. Enough time. Enough compassion. He was right. There was. The grandson, who worked in telecommunications and had never known war, turned the radio over in his hands, puzzled by the significance his grandfather had attached to this obsolete machine. He could not understand. But perhaps that was the point. The snow falls in silence over the Ardennes. The forests have regrown. The foxholes have softened into the earth. The men who fought there are nearly all gone now, their voices fading into history. But the lessons remain, encoded not in monuments or textbooks, but in small objects and small gestures. A radio, broken and then repaired. A meal, given freely to an enemy. A shrug and the words, "Why not?" These are the things that endure when the guns fall silent. These are the truths that empires, for all their power, can never quite suppress. That abundance is more powerful than scarcity. That generosity is more durable than cruelty. That the capacity to fix a broken thing, whether a radio, a society, or a life, is the measure of a civilization's strength. The Germans expected to conquer. They expected to impose their will. They did not expect kindness. And that, more than any weapon, was what defeated them. Not the might of American industry, though that was vast. Not the bravery of American soldiers, though that was real. but the quiet, radical assertion that the world did not have to be a place of endless struggle, that there was enough, that even enemies could be human beings again once the fighting stopped, that a broken radio could be fixed for no other reason than that it should be. The snow continues to fall, burying the past. But some truths do not stay buried. They hum, faintly, like static across the decades, waiting for those who know how to listen.